Hi again, 205. We are going to continue talking about sampling in this video, and I'm going to try to do one fun thing at the end. So, very quick catch up from the last video. We said that there were two sort of major umbrella categories of sampling. And the first type is probability sampling, and that was what the last video focused on. Probability sampling uses random sampling or some form of pseudo-random sampling. And the reason that it does that is because randomness, and I want you to sort of write this down, randomness equals representativeness when you do it right and there are enough people in the sample. So if you want a sample to be representative, you randomly select. But we're going to talk about non-probability samples in this video. These are sampling frames that do not use any type of random selection, and there's lots of reasons for why you may have to do that. So let's go through each one of these. The first type of non-random sample or non-probability sample is a quota sample. This is when elements or units are sampled in proportion to their representation in the population. So here's an example of that. If you sampled 300 men and 300 women, if the ratio in the population was 50-50 and you wanted to get that breakdown, that's not randomness, but you are trying to fulfill a certain quota. The quota doesn't have to be gender related. It could be any demographic, or if you're not sampling people, it can be related to some other feature. The second one is called a heterogeneity sample. This is sampling for the purpose of finding a diverse range of ideas instead of trying to find out what is representative of the population. So you're kind of sampling ideas rather than people. So here's an example of this off the top of my head. Earlier in the course, we talked about how we speak about abortion opinion incorrectly, as though it's just pro-life or pro-choice and there's nothing in between, when in fact there's lots of different opinions that are on that spectrum. So maybe if researchers initially realize that, you know, it's not just yes or no, there are sort of gradations of this thing, maybe they would go out and do a heterogeneity sample to find out what are the different ideas that are out there. Let's get as many possible ideas about what this opinion entails so that we can build better survey questions and ask this question better in the future so that we know all of these different possibilities. To be honest, I don't see this one used in 205 papers very much, but I wanted to give you that example so you knew that it existed. That's a heterogeneity sample. A snowball sample. Some of you might use this for your final paper. This is when subjects are asked to identify other people who might qualify for inclusion in the sample. So I want you to think about, I find someone and I give them my survey or I conduct my study with them, and then I ask them, imagine that they are this this black face down here. I ask them, do you know other people who qualify for this study who you think would talk to me? And they say, yeah, I know, you know, Jane, Bob, and Mary. And so I go find Jane, Bob, and Mary. I conduct my study with them, and then they give me the names of people that they think would participate. So it snowballs out. Now, there's really two reasons that we would do this. This is very useful when we have topics that are sensitive in nature. So, for example, in medical studies, there are certain diseases that people don't like, you know, just admitting that they have. It's very personal, it's sensitive. So if you were to find someone that had that disease, whatever it is, they might know other people that have that disease. They could point you in their direction and say, you know, I know this guy, James, he's got the same condition that I do. I think he'd be willing to talk to you. So there's lots of different reasons this might happen in the political world as well. Just think about what topics are sensitive. If you're trying to understand why people, um, uh, or if you're trying to understand, LGBT issues, some people are very personal about that. They don't want to talk about that openly to just anyone doing a survey. You might find someone who is in the LGBT community and they can point you in the direction of other people who might be willing to speak with you. If you are studying hate groups, not everyone wants to just openly admit that they affiliate with a hate group. There are people who study this, and what they need to do is find people who are, willing to admit to this, and then they can find other people through them. So when I ask you guys to do your online activity this week, I'm going to ask you, come up with examples for a snowball sample. Try to think about topics that are kind of sensitive like that. Another reason that we might use this is simply that there's a population, there's nothing particularly sensitive about them, but they're hard to reach because they're a small group. So if you're studying, for example, third parties or small parties in this country, and you really want to get to people who are part of the Constitution Party, that's a small party, there's not that many people involved in it, you might be able to find one or two of those people, but they're going to have to point you in the direction of others, because you can't just randomly sample the country and hope that you're going to land on some people who affiliate with the Constitution Party. It's almost certainly not going to happen. So those are two of the reasons that we would use a snowball sample. Here's one that we can talk about for a few minutes. Accidental, haphazard, but most of us use the phrase convenience sample. This is drawing a sample from a population that is close at hand or convenient for the researcher. So the only reason the researcher is using this sample is because it's easy for them to access these people. So let's talk about two scenarios this is very common in. The first scenario is if you are running a lab experiment. If you're doing something in a lab and people have to physically walk into that lab and be present in that space in order to do that study, there's no way that you can randomly sample the country. You can't just random digit dial anyone in the country, call up someone in Oklahoma and say, will you come into my lab at the College of Charleston to do this study? It's never going to happen, but you have to get someone in there. So oftentimes we will use college students, and you've maybe done this before, as our sample. If we're not using college students, we're probably using local residents that we've put out some sort of advertisement to try to get them to come into the lab. The only reason that we're using those people is purely because it is convenient for us, and lab studies pretty much require that convenience sample. Another reason that's very common that we might do this is if we have a survey, it could be a regular observational survey, although I'll talk about the problems with that in a minute, or a survey experiment where we embed the experiment into the survey. We could use college students to take that, but we can also use online survey takers. There is a website called Mechanical Turk, and thousands of people from across the country log on to this website as survey takers, and you can make small amounts of money to perform online tasks or surveys. So you can make, 50 cents for taking a 15-minute survey. That is a convenience sample. We're not looking specifically for those exact people to take our survey, but if we want a group that's a bit more diverse than college students, we may have to go to Mechanical Turk, and those people can take our survey. So those are sort of two big reasons, but I want to talk a little bit more about the biases that come with this type of sample, because we use them a lot and we have to know what type of bias occurs when we use convenience samples. So first of all, are these two groups biased? Yes. So this is usually an exercise I would do with you guys in class, but I want you to think about why college students, our first type of convenience sample, might be so different from the rest of the world. So first of all, they're younger on average. That's just true, right? You guys are mostly between the ages of 18 and 25. So you're younger than the average person. You might be more college educated because you are in college. Not everyone in the United States graduates from college. You might have higher income families in that group. That means you're affording to go to college. College is very expensive, as you know. So students might be higher income than the average American. Along with that, you might have a higher socioeconomic status on average than the average American. So that's a biased sample. Let's talk about people that take surveys on the internet, which are also used a lot for studies in political behavior and political psychology and voting. So on the Mechanical Turk website, what type of biases are going to come with this sample? Well, the people that are on this website might just be more internet savvy. They know that Mechanical Turk exists. A lot of people don't know that it exists. So they might just be more in the know and more internet savvy to begin with. They might be younger. The internet may have a younger skew to it. They might be lower income on average because they're online taking surveys for money. You're probably not going to get a lot of really wealthy people doing that because they don't need to. So there's many different ways in which that sample is biased as well. Will this affect our results? Well, of course it will. It will to different degrees depending on what type of design you're using. If you're just doing a regular survey, an observational survey, let's say that you ask people what their income is no, let's use a different example. Let's say you want to know how they feel about building a border wall on the border of Mexico. If I go to try to publish that and I say, look, I found that, 22% of people in my internet online study said that they support a border wall with Mexico, or 22% of my student sample said that, someone would say, how can you want to publish this? You're trying to make a generalization about the entire American population and their opinion towards a wall, and you're only sampling college students. That's a really biased sample. Or you're only sampling people on the internet. That's a really biased sample. That does not represent the larger US population. So for a regular observational study, that's going to be a big problem. It's better to use convenience samples if you are doing experiments. And this is where you really have to understand the difference between experiments and other types of studies. When you have an experiment, you take that biased sample, all of those students, okay, and you randomly assign them into a treatment group and a control group. So now you have two groups that are completely demographically equivalent on average. The only difference is that, for example, this group sees a political ad and this group doesn't. So they're the same, except for one thing. You can still claim causality even though that sample was biased from the outset, because now we have these two separate and equal groups, except for this one thing. One group saw the ad and one group didn't. You can still claim causality with a biased sample because you're making them into demographically equivalent groups with that one exception. And lastly, we have something called a purposive sample. This is a sample chosen subjectively by the researcher to fulfill the purpose of the study. There's many ways that you could go about doing this. So the first example is typical case. Let's say that you wanted to hear opinions on healthcare from typical Democrats, right? These are people that sort of represent the average Democrat or the median Democrat. You can subjectively determine who you think sort of represents that typical case. Example number 2, an extreme case sampling. This is the opposite, obviously. This is when you want to find cases that are very, very extreme. Maybe you're looking for certain people that call themselves Democrats, but they have a borderline communist ideology. That's a really, really extreme example and pretty rare. Or maybe you are sampling Republicans and you want to find someone who has an authoritarian ideology. So these things are extreme cases. Actually, there's a book about people who are really still obsessed with the Civil War. Actually, I'll grab the book for you. This book, Confederates in the Attic, really interesting book. This is about people who are still sort of obsessed with the Confederacy and the Civil War. And this author, Tony Horowitz, is basically sampling extreme cases. He's finding people that are very, very extreme in how the Civil War incorporates itself into their lifestyle. So he's going after that sort of outlier type of person. And then the final purpose of sample is expert sampling, right? There's many reasons why we sample experts if we want to hear their opinion about something. So for example, there is a survey that comes out about once a month as of a few years ago, and it's called the Brightline Watch Survey. And they are interested in sampling people that are political scientists, basically. So I get a survey once a month because I'm deemed an expert by the people who are doing this. And they ask us questions periodically about the state of democracy in this country, what types of events in the current political climate are considered normal or abnormal, important, democratic, undemocratic. So they can show the opinions of experts on average compared to the opinions of the public on average. And they've subjectively said, I mean, I am an expert by definition because I have a PhD in this, but they're saying we are going to use people that we consider to be experts on democracy. So those were your non-probability samples. And now I'm going to attempt to do my one fun thing. My husband and I have taught our dog how to do a trick where he hugs us. So I'm going to try to do that. And if I do it well, I don't have to do this entire video again. Hey, Eddie, come here. Eddie. Come here. Come here. Okay, sit. Sit. Good boy. Hug. Oh, no. Eddie, sit. Hug. No. No. Eddie, hug. Oh, there we go. Guys, he's usually pretty good at that. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to redo the whole video again. So I hope you enjoyed that. See you next time.
What did he do?